Fans of the Seahawks are hoping to see John Schneider reel in a big fish on the offensive line. Just how close did they come to actually making it happen? We'll be breaking it all down here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined here on our Tuesday episode by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang, and a special thanks to all the 12s who are tuning in. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it, whether you're tuning in from nearby Issaquah, Washington, or way across the country in Miami, Florida. And for a few of you in the comments, yeah, we started a few minutes late because I did have to shine my bald head. So you're welcome. Free agency is officially going to start tomorrow for the Seattle Seahawks and the rest of the NFL. Obviously, tons of movement in the first 2 days here with legal tampering, at least for most teams. We'll be breaking down why the Seahawks haven't made a lot of moves here leading up to this point. We're going to break down the DK Metcalf trade and Seattle's stockpile of draft picks, now resulting in part because of that deal. And we've got the best remaining free agents heading into the first real day of free agency tomorrow. Without further ado, let's get to it. Now for your lead story here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Typically this time of year, it's a little bit of a snooze fest for Seahawk fans because historically John Schneider hasn't taken opportunities to try to sign big name players, particularly offensive linemen, dishing out big contracts. That has not been his MO. With that being said, the Seahawks entered this week with more than $70 million in cap space after trading Geno Smith and DK Metcalf. And not surprisingly, this is something we talked about last week, there has been some movement trying to get some players signed here in these first couple of days. And Rob, one of those did work out for the Seahawks. Sam Darnold is now the new starting quarterback that will be running Clint Kubiak's offense. But the other big move that nearly happened, but unfortunately did not, Will Freeze, formerly of the Indianapolis Colts, signing a 5-year deal with the Minnesota Vikings worth $88 million. And if that sounds like a ton of money, it is. We're talking more than $17.5 million per year. But really the sticking point here, it was the years. And in fact, from my sources talking yesterday, the Seahawks were optimistic that they had this wrapped up with a 3-year deal worth $52 million, which is Draymond Jones money. That would be the biggest contract that John Schneider has ever handed an offensive lineman. So there was actually work being done to try to make this happen. But once the Vikings swoop back in with a 5-year deal, the Seahawks, they drop back. We're not doing a 4th and 5th year. That was just a bit too much for John Schneider and for the ownership group. So we're back to square one where the Seahawks haven't added anybody in the offensive line except for Josh Jones, who's a swing tackle. No big splashy moves. They did get Sam Darnold. Kind of puts the Seahawks in a precarious spot, at least from fans' standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. From fan standpoint, it is Panicville. Oh my goodness, the Seahawks are going to be terrible. Their offensive line is going to be terrible. You trade away Geno Smith, you trade away DK Metcalf. But, Corbin, I think that, in these first couple of days of the Tampa free agency period, I think that everybody's got to just kind of calm down a little bit. As you correctly pointed out, Seattle made arguably the splashiest signing of anybody with the signing of Sam Darnold. They brought in, retained their own key free agent in Ernest Jones. I love the signing of Josh Jones. Look, I recognize the fact that he came in as a 3rd-round pick. I had a high 2nd-round grade on him. We came out of Houston as a 4-year starter at the left tackle position. He has played every position along the offensive line in the NFL except for center. He is exactly the type of swing offensive lineman that this team needed. He's going to be able to be the guy that they thought that they were bringing in with George Fant, who of course went down with an injury a year ago. I think that the outside tackle position is actually every bit as much of a concern for the Seahawks than guard is, because Abraham Lucas, you know that he is a good player when he's healthy, and the belief is that he is healthy. But I really thought they needed to make sure that they had a quality backup plan behind him. And they just did that with Josh Jones, who again has that guard versatility and his offensive tackle experience, as I talked about before. I think that sets him up very nicely in terms of having the mobility to be a fit at guard, and Clint Kubiak, and more importantly, John Benton's version of the blocking attack. So again, I think that is a signing to celebrate. On the other hand, and I've heard Freeze, I've heard Fries. I don't give a damn if his name is Tater Tot at this point. I just see a player who was a 4-year starter at Penn State, who has had one quality year as a starter in the NFL. That was the right guard position. Now, look, give Minnesota credit. They are pairing him with Ryan Kelly, who was, in my opinion, the best offensive lineman for the Indianapolis Colts before. I think he's going to wind up being the best offensive lineman for the Minnesota Vikings. And so Freeze, Fries, whatever, and Ryan Kelly, both going to the Minnesota Vikings. And I would just ask people to kind of go back in time a little bit. When you look at the aforementioned player that Minnesota signed, that Seattle apparently was unable to sign, again, think about the quarterbacks that he was blocking for. He was blocking for an incredible dual threat guy in Anthony Richardson and a straight downhill spectacular running back in Jonathan Taylor. And then when it wasn't Anthony Richardson, then it was Joe Flacco, who is as, old and saged as it is at the quarterback position. Those are two quarterbacks that are going to allow a guard to look, frankly, better than he is. So if you look at his grades over the first couple of years in the NFL as a 7th-round pick, the 9th to last player selected in 2021, look, I give him all the credit in the world. I'm excited for the young man. He just signed an $88 million contract. That's crazy talk for a guard, especially a right guard. Look, I think that there are good players available at the guard position already on Seattle's roster. They're young and they need some coaching. That's why I think it was critical that Seattle brought in the coaches that they did. But I also think that there are some quality guards that are still available in free agency. The world is not ending because the Seahawks did not give the biggest contract in league history, at least in team history, to a guy who has been good for 1 year. And I don't think that he'll be able to replicate that ever again with the Minnesota Vikings. Now they're going to have a young quarterback in J.J. McCarthy under center.
It's interesting because this would have easily been the biggest contract that John Schneider has given an offensive lineman, let alone a guard, if this would have worked out and the Vikings didn't come in with those extra 2 years. But if you look at John Schneider's history, 90% of the contracts that he signs with players on long-term deals, it doesn't max out but beyond 3 years. That is typically how he does business. And with a player that's coming off of a broken tibia, like Freeze is, that was something that it was hesitant from John Schneider's standpoint. And think about it, when you add a 4th and 5th year to a deal, you have to add more guaranteed money onto a contract like that. And the Vikings offered $34 million in full guarantees. And full guarantees, you have to pay future money into an escrow account. So you got to have cash up front. And so you added all these factors and then bigger signing bonuses. That means you got to have more cash right up front to pay the player. The Seahawks were not interested in doing 4 or 5 years on this. And so once that became apparent that the Vikings deal was the one they had to match, there were too many factors at play here that, look, we like this guy, but we're not going to go down that road. And I will tell fans this, and listen, if you've been following me, I've been monitoring free agency as closely as anybody here the last 2 days, to the point that my eyes have started to shake because I'm looking at my screen so much, trying to figure out what's going on. And look, I was critical of John Schneider this morning, and I think there's still room to be critical to an extent because you just wonder, why can't you close a deal like this? But for fans that are saying, well, there hasn't been any effort made, look, this is a lot like when Joe Thuney was a free agent a few years back. Seattle had a really good offer on the table for him, and they just ultimately bowed out right before the Chiefs signed him. So this is not the first time that John Schneider has been actively involved at the end, and he's trying to get a top-of-the-line guard in a free agent class. He has tried, but in this case, it's just the 4th and 5th year. And listen, this is my opinion. I wouldn't have given him a 5-year contract. I would not have gone down that road. I think 3 for $52, that's probably the most that I would have gone, and I think that's the right deal. 5 years, that's a long time in the NFL to pay a guy. So There's all kinds of different wrinkles to this, but fans do need to understand that John Schneider, at least it looks like he is very actively trying to. I don't know if this means he's going to go after anybody else at this point, because that looks to be the player that they had money bookmarked for. So we'll see what ends up happening when free agency opens tomorrow. And I'm sure we'll talk about a few other guards when we get later into the show, Rob.
Yeah, no question about it. And that's the other thing is you mentioned some things there about the guaranteed dollars and the escrow things that are kind of, allowing people to kind of peek behind the curtain a little bit. Here's another one. And I mentioned the tamper period. Of course, this is still a tamper period. The actual free agency begins tomorrow. The other aspect about that tamper period is that you cannot allow players to come in and do a medical evaluation. And as you mentioned, he is coming off of a broken leg. I think that the Seahawks, especially considering the amount of dollars that we're talking about here, then they would be out of their mind not to bring a player in, do a medical evaluation here before you're going to sign that type of a contract. Look, again, I'm excited for the young man. I think this is awesome for him. I think this is a mistake by the Minnesota Vikings. I think it's one that is going to hurt them in the long term. I would be stunned if this young man is able to keep up his entire five-year contract with Minnesota. I think they're just kind of kicking the can and hoping, and that's an awful lot of money. If somebody else's money, that the Minnesota Vikings decision makers are making here. Again, I think that this is a move that Seattle is ultimately going to wind up looking better for not making this move.
When we come back, we have not had a chance to talk about the DK Metcalf trade here on Locked On Seahawks since it happened late on Sunday. We are finally going to take a deep dive into why DK Metcalf is no longer with the Seahawks and what the draft outlook now looks like for the Seahawks, adding another day 2 selection that's coming up next year on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Locked On Seahawks is sponsored by BetterHelp. Taking care of your mental health can feel like a big investment, but it's just as important as taking care of your body. Traditional in-person therapy can cost anywhere from $100 to $250 per session, but with BetterHelp, you can save up to 50% per session. BetterHelp offers a flat fee for weekly online therapy sessions, making professional support more accessible and more affordable. With over 30,000 therapists and over 5 million people worldwide being helped, it's the world's largest online therapy platform. Therapy worked wonders for me in the past when I was struggling to deal with family-related health issues, but don't just take my word for it. If you are struggling to navigate obstacles, mental health and counseling can be invaluable. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist today and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Get 10% off your first month at BetterHelp.com/lockedon. That's 10% off your first month of online therapy at BetterHelp.com/lockedon. Welcome back to the Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. He's Rob Rang. A special thanks to all the 12s who are tuning in. And thank you, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. It's the time of year where significant stories can kind of sneak under the rug. And when you look at the way that things have gone the last 4 or 5 days for the Seattle Seahawks, it has just been one massive story after another. We saw the Geno Smith trade last Friday. 2 days later, DK Metcalf is heading to the Pittsburgh Steelers. And then you had Sam Darnold, all these different wrinkles getting thrown in. And Rob, you had a pro day to cover yesterday too. So we finally have an opportunity to talk about the DK Metcalf trade to the Pittsburgh Steelers. And some fans are going to say, where did the Steelers enter into the picture here? Look, once DK Metcalf made it known that he was requesting a trade and that leak came out, you were going to have other teams that inquired. And John Schneider said a bunch of teams had contacted him. Absolutely. You had the Green Bay Packers, New England Patriots early in the process in the combine checking in, and a bunch of other teams were peeking in to see if they could make this deal. And ultimately, a second-round pick number 52, that was the maximum package that the Seahawks could get for DK Metcalf. And Rob, it revolves around the fact that they had to turn around and give him a 5-year, $150 million contract. You can now maybe see why John Schneider was having some issues trying to get an extension worked out because that was a price that the Seahawks just were not going to pay.
Yeah, exactly. It was just like the conversation we just had a moment ago about the former Indianapolis Colts right guard. Now, presumably, Minnesota's, I assume they're going to keep him at the right guard position. And I have to say this real quick, going back again to the Fries Freeze conversation here, Quentin Nelson, of course, the left guard for the Colts, along with Ryan Kelly at center. To me, were the cream of the crop for that Indianapolis Colts team. And again, I think that makes things a lot easier to play right guard when you have two all-pro caliber players alongside him. And that kind of ties into the DK Metcalf conversation here, Corbin, because look, if DK Metcalf was an all-pro player, not an all-pro talent, but an actual all-pro player, then yeah, I think that John Schneider and the Seahawks were signed off on a 5-year, $150 million deal. That is the going rate for all-pro wide receivers. He just hasn't demonstrated that. You see the flashes, you know what unbelievable talent that he is, but it's always kind of bothered me that I remember, I think it was a couple of years ago, maybe it was this past training camp, where basically they were asking him to, kind of just talk about his own work ethic and the work ethic of a guy like, say, a Jake Bobo or Jackson Smith and Jigba. And he kind of was very complimentary of those players and then said about his own work ethic that, no, they have to work out, meaning like defensive backs have to work out to prepare for me. And I do see a DK Metcalf who is an unbelievable physical talent. And again, it seems like he was born in a weight room, but at the same time, the routes have always been a little bit sloppy. There's no question about it. For a guy who's paid to catch the ball, there's an awful lot of drops out there. And obviously the personal fouls and things of that nature were very frustrating as well. DK Metcalf is one of my all-time favorite Seahawks because I just saw a guy that was more physically gifted than any player I think that the Seahawks have ever had at any position, and certainly at the wide receiver position. And considering the fact that, he was on the heels of Tyler Lockett, whose production speaks for itself, Steve Largent, whose production speaks for itself, to have a player as gifted as DK Metcalf is, and yet never really, achieve his full potential, at least in my opinion, it was disappointing. And so I applaud the Seahawks, frankly, for deciding to move on past a player who, again, maybe was never going to reach his full potential in Seattle. And if you wanted to pay him, because, again, I think that he has an unbelievable talent, but at the same time, what you're saying basically is that you want to build your team around DK Metcalf and the passing game. And I just don't think that's how you win unless you have a quarterback like a Patrick Mahomes or somebody like that. And that's what your team identity is. I don't think that's what John Schneider and Mike McDowell want. I think that they want this to be a defensive-oriented football team that's going to run the ball right down your throat. And so I don't think that Seattle's going to find a wide receiver is going to put necessarily as many touchdowns as I think that DK Metcalf is going to have with the Pittsburgh Steelers, assuming, of course, that they have some quarterback with some real talent that's going to be able to get him the ball. At the same time, I also don't think that the Pittsburgh Steelers are very likely to win a Super Bowl, at least not until they find themselves an answer at the quarterback position, whereas I think that Seattle is investing in the way that should allow them to compete for a Super Bowl sooner rather than later.
But that's where the discussion about pivoting and getting the offensive line shored up. That's where this discussion comes in because, and we talked about this last week when we were just discussing the possibility that DK Metcalf could get traded, that you're going to have to reinvent the way that this offense runs. And part of it is going to be this scheme. Clint Kubiak's going to play more 2 tight end and 2 running back sets. That's going to be part of the equation. But this is going to have to be a team that can run the ball, not just to protect Sam Darnold, but because you are not going to have the same explosive weapons that you can just chuck the ball downfield and get big plays with. That is not going to be as frequent. Now, maybe they add a couple of receivers in free agency in the draft that allow them to open things up, not as much as they did before, but still be able to open it up some. But they're going to have to be able to run the ball. And so the good news with all of this, with trading Geno Smith and getting a 3rd-round pick, trading DK Metcalf and getting that 2nd-rounder from the Pittsburgh Steelers, the good news is you have a ton of draft capital. Look no further than the 3 compensatory picks that were announced today as well. You've got 10 selections. If you are John Schneider, you have 5 of them in the first 92 picks. With that 92nd pick they get from the Raiders, pick 50. It should actually say on there, pick number 52, not 53. That's the one they got from the Steelers. and then getting 2 fifth-round comp picks. This is the exciting thing, Rob. When we were looking at projections for compensatory picks, everybody was projecting 4th, 5th, and 6th. Seattle ended up getting a 4th and 2 fifths. And we still haven't seen the final swap details for the Steelers with the Seahawks with the 6th and 7th round picks. The Seahawks will have another 6th rounder, and they'll be sending their 7th to Pittsburgh. So not a full list, fully confirmed here until the trade goes through officially tomorrow with DK Metcalf going to the Pittsburgh Steelers. But the Seahawks right now have 10 picks. They got 5 in the first 92. The opportunity is there to take advantage early in those first 3 rounds and get this cabinet restocked on offense, from the offensive line to the skill positions, so that this group can recover from all these departures that they've had here over the last week.
Yeah, and again, when you have 10 selections and 5 of them in the first 3 rounds, I think obviously that's pretty exciting stuff. Certainly for a guy like me who is, lives and breathes the NFL draft. So that certainly is exciting. And, I have been among those who've been critical of this 2025 draft class. It does not have the elite top end talent. It does have very good depth. I think that day 2 is a wonderful spot to have several selections. Of course, Seattle currently has 4 picks. And I'll say this, Corbin, there's so many people out there who are just like, freaking out again. I almost wonder if Seattle decides to do something that we don't see John Schneider do very often, and that might be aggressively trade up. And now you have the selections to do that. And everybody was thinking that, if they're going to trade up, it's going to be for a quarterback. I'm just going to throw out an idea and let people kind of chew on it for a little bit, because it is going to gather some steam, I think, if Seattle doesn't make any type of a splashy free agent move at wide receiver. Travis Hunter. If he is available at, say, 3 or 5, I can just tell you what I would do. I would consider trading all 5 of those top 100 selections to go up and get him. I think he's that dynamic of a talent. I think the 2 biggest areas of concern for the Seahawks, I know everybody's freaking out about the offensive line. That is not my biggest area of concern anymore. I have that kind of faith in the young talent that Seattle already has along the offensive line and the coachings that the Seahawks have. I do have huge concerns at the wide receiver position. I have some concern at cornerback, because we know that Seattle just shipped away Geno Smith and DK Metcalf, and I didn't think that either one of them really had the leadership and the work ethic that Mike McDowell and John Schneider were prioritizing. So what would suggest that maybe Tariq Woolen is going to be somebody that the Seahawks would invest highly in? So I think the cornerback is also a fairly significant need for this team long term. And I believe that Travis Hunter is that one-of-one type of player who can play on both sides. I don't know that Seattle will actually make that kind of a gutsy move, but I do think that there is wide receiver talent. And if it's not Travis Hunter, a Matthew Golden, a Luther Burden III, to me, those are 2 guys that you could be sitting there at number 18 overall that I think that immediate speed, immediate juice, immediate big play ability to kind of make Seattle's offensive big play ability come back. And again, I just have more faith in Seattle's young talent along the offensive line than a lot of people seem to have.
And I think trading up to get a wide receiver is very possible in this draft. Maybe you trade up into the top 10 to do that, because it's not a deep class. There's not a ton of first-round caliber players, but there's a few that you just rattled off. McMillan is viewed as the number 1 receiver by a lot of people. I am not in that group either, but he is a big-bodied target that wins downfield. If Seattle is looking for that, because DK Metcalf's not there anymore, maybe they consider that. I'm all in on the Matthew Golden train. I think his speed with Sam Darnold had more air yards on deep passes than any quarterback in the NFL last year. It wasn't Geno Smith or Patrick Mahomes, it was Sam Darnold. So give him a guy with 4.29 speed and let him run and get the football for you. But I think Golden could be a guy that goes earlier than people are talking about. Does Seattle move up a few spots to get it? And I also will add this real quick before we move to the next segment. If Jackson Dart is a player that they are really high on, which my understanding is they like the kid, Sam Darnold's contract is really a 2-year, $55 million contract when you look at the details. And it would cost him $19 million to move on from him. What if he doesn't play great this next year? And you have Jackson Dart waiting in the wings. I'm just saying, I'm throwing this out there. This does not stop Seattle from potentially getting a quarterback early in this draft either, if the right one is there. So There's all kinds of fun stuff that we can talk about here, and we're going to have a lot of time to do that before the draft gets here end of April. But when you have 10 picks and you have 5 in the first 3 rounds, it gives you a lot of ability to play around. And you know that John Schneider is getting hyped about that, the ability to be able to move up and down the board and do some crazy things. So we've got a lot of scenarios we'll be diving into, but we got to get through free agency first. And we're going to look at the best remaining free agents. Rob and I have our own lists and a few guys that aren't in the market yet that we want to talk about as well. We'll get to that coming up next here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is a message from our sponsor, Intuit TurboTax. Texas was waiting and wondering and worrying if you were going to get any money back, and then waiting, wondering, and worrying some more. Now Taxes is matching with a TurboTax expert who can do your taxes as soon as today, an expert who gives your taxes their undivided attention as they work on your return while you get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on your day. An expert who will find you every deduction possible and file every form, every investment, everything with 100% accuracy, all so you can get most of the money back guaranteed. No waiting, no wondering, no worries. Now this is Taxes. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live full service. Real-time updates only in iOS mobile app. See guaranteed details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. Welcome back to the Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined as always by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s who are listening in. Thank you as always for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. Sam Darnold is the new quarterback for the Seattle Seahawks. That was the big move that's been made so far by John Schneider, but just 2 signings announced here in the 2 days of the legal tampering period. Darnold will get to sign that contract tomorrow, as will Josh Jones, the swing tackle that they added. Missing out on Will Free is also a big deal as well, but there's still plenty of good players out there. Obviously, most of the top 50 free agents have already been spoken for, but there's still plenty of talent out there for John Schneider to be able to try to go after here the next couple of days with free agency officially opening on Wednesday. And Rob, I'm going to throw the mic your way here because with Freeze not going to Seattle and becoming a Viking instead, as you mentioned, there's going to be a lot of fans that are going to be throwing a fit, freaking out like, oh no, end of the world. The guard pack is getting pretty slim pickings, but there's still a couple guys that could make a lot of sense for the Seahawks. And I believe you and I are both on the same tangent with who the best available is for this scheme that Clint Kubiak is going to be running in 2025.
Not necessarily. I mean, I think that Tevin Jenkins from Chicago is an interesting guy, and he has the youth that I would be prioritizing. But for me, at this point, I think that's Brandon Scherf. He is the right guard, similar to the aforementioned player that signed with the Minnesota Vikings. He has been a more durable player. And I remember when he signed his splashy deal with the Jacksonville Jaguars years ago, and everybody thought that was crazy money to give to a guard, even a guy who was selected, I believe it was 5th overall all those years ago. Again, not a very late 7th round pick like the other player that we talked about before. And Brandon Scherf is a guy who has been durable. He is in his early third. I believe he's 33 years old at this point, so much older than what I would like. However, he has played all 17 games each of the past 3 seasons for the Jacksonville Jaguars. He's probably going to command a 2-year deal, and you're probably going to have to overpay for him. But at the same time, again, one of the things that I really think is important is that Seattle is going to be investing in another veteran offensive lineman. And I'm not certain that they're going to. But if they do, I want to be a tough guy. I want to be the meanest, nastiest guy in their entire offensive line meeting room. And that to me is something that Scherf has been his entire NFL career. So again, I don't think that this is quite as big of a priority as a lot of people seem to believe. But I do think that if you're going to bring somebody in, he's got to be a leader who has some just badassness to him. And he has that. Now, I'll mention a couple other players that I think are intriguing, not necessarily at the guard position, but just some of the best player available. As I talked about before, I think the cornerback is kind of a sneaky need for this club, at least in my opinion. So a guy who has the size and length and all that kind of stuff that, we know the Seahawks have always prioritized. Benjamin St. Juste and then Asante Samuel is on the exact flip side of that, a 5'10", 180-pounder who himself is coming off of an injury. And so therefore, I think that you will see him sign relatively quickly now that teams are going to be able to kind of check out and see how he is doing medically. And then finally, I'll mention one other player here. And again, I think we're going to see some of this happen. I think you're going to see a lot of NFL teams who are going to extend themselves too far and then suddenly have to start cutting some veterans. Cooper Kupp from the LA Rams. Obviously, everybody knows who Cooper Kupp is. But if he is released, to me, he could be one of those guys. And there's a number of other veterans out there in many positions that could get cut or even be franchised currently. That Seattle has a salary cap space to play around a little bit. So again, the fact that Seattle doesn't sign anybody yet, any of these big name players other than Sam Darnold from outside of their own roster, don't fret. Seattle still has plenty of salary cap space to do all kinds of different creative things. The season is several months away, not tomorrow.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned Brandon Scherff because I think if we were talking about Ryan Grubb's scheme, I would be completely on board with you because I love the toughness and I think he's better as a gap scheme-oriented blocker. They're going to be looking for guys that can move, get out in space. They want linemen that can run. And at least at this stage of his career, that is not going to be something that Brandon Scherff is going to be excelling in. He's still an athletic guy, but he's not going to be somebody that's going to really check off that box at this stage of his career. Tevin Jenkins, if you turn on the Bears tape, and yes, their offensive line was not good. That's why they've signed 3 guys already this free agency period. But I thought Jenkins was the one real bright spot for this team last year, and he has a tackle background. So he does have the athleticism, at least light enough feet that he can do the zone blocking stuff. I believe that he was the 7th or 8th highest ranked graded Pro Football Focus zone blocker this past season among guards. He had a really nice score. You can watch the tape and it kind of backed it up. But he's had injuries. So that makes me wonder if you can get him at maybe more of that John Schneider discount that he likes to do, but you're getting a good football player that has played well when he's been healthy. He's been a bright spot. And again, he's only 27 years old. I think he makes sense from that standpoint. And I'm also going to mention Mekhi Becton. And I know that a lot of people are going to hear that name and say, but he's 6'7", 360 pounds. Like that guy can't move. Did you watch the Philadelphia Eagles this year? There's a couple plays in the Super Bowl that he got out on zone runs and was just decking dudes at the second level. You have to remember, this guy had one of the most freakish testing days we have seen from a man that size at the combine. He was a tackle his first several years in the league, and then he moved inside last year. He's a really good athlete for a player of his size, and he was good in all blocking schemes last year. And oh, by the way, he's 25 years old, and he's played for John Benton before. So that's another name. I don't know that he's as good of a fit as Tevin Jenkins, but for people that say, well, he's strictly a gap blocker, you need to turn on the film. Mekhi Becton can do zone blocking and make it look like gap blocking because he takes up 2 blocks. So he's a fun guy to watch. And as far as a couple other players worth monitoring on the offensive line, Josh Myers is kind of one of those, not a master of any trade, but good at a number of things. He hasn't necessarily broke out the way that I thought he was going to coming out of Ohio State, but he's a player that is highly respected. He has played in a similar offensive system for Matt LaFleur in Green Bay. I think it would make a lot of sense for Seattle to at least kick the tires there and see if he might be a possibility at the center position. And on the outside, a couple of the other receivers I've mentioned, Joshua Palmer's already been plucked up. There's been a few other receivers I thought might be interesting to Seattle, but Elijah Moore is still available, and he has been the guy that I have had highlighted. If you're looking for some big playability, he just needs a quarterback that can get him the football. Like the poor guy has had anybody that was the Jets, which it was right after Sam Darnold left. So he's actually never played with Sam Darnold. He had all those bad quarterbacks of the Jets, goes to Cleveland. We know what's happened with Deshaun Watson and Jameis Winston and all the different quarterbacks they've rotated through. He's had nobody to get him the ball consistently. So I still think Elijah Moore makes a lot of sense for the Seattle Seahawks to help fill some of that gap getting some receiver production back. Still a player that I think has a lot of untapped potential. And then go to the other side of the coin, a veteran. I was going to mention Harold Landry. The Patriots plucked him up, so he is no longer available. But Matt Judon, who was let go by the Atlanta Falcons, he's 32. He's getting to be an older player, but he's still productive, an outstanding leader. Seattle could use another guy off the edge that can do some things and is a versatile player. And oh, by the way, Mike McDonald, Matt Judon is one of his favorite players ever, coached him for a number of years in Baltimore. Matt Judon and DeMarcus Lawrence from the Cowboys, who played for Aden Durde, two veterans that are on the tail end of their career, but they still could be productive, have familiarity with this coaching staff. I think both those players make sense. And I know that you'll want to talk about this one too, real quick before we close out. Clint Kubiak wants a fullback. The San Francisco 49ers are expected to release Kyle Juszczyk. If he gets released, I expect that Clint Kubiak and company will be on the phone before the ink dries on the transaction wire. He got to coach him in San Francisco 2 years ago. And how fun would it be to do the opposite of Richard Sherman and bring in an icon like Kyle Juszczyk that I think is still a good player? You want a fullback, a guy that can do a little bit of everything. Kyle Juszczyk can still get it done. That, to me, would be an exciting addition in this offense.
It absolutely could be if Kyle Juszczyk is still healthy. You know, I mean, he's been to like 9 consecutive Pro Bowls or something like that. I mean, he's a legendary player. Again, when you're playing the fullback position, I have a little bit of concern about just how much tread is left on the tires, but I think that it's worth kicking the tires, so to speak. And then really quickly, you mentioned all these different defensive linemen, and I agree with you, but there's a lot of very good ones out there. And so I would talk about a couple of young pass rushers that used to be kind of draft crushes that haven't quite panned out, but still might be able to be kind of a pass rush specialist in Azeez Ojulari, Josh Uche. There's a couple of guys that, again, a lot of Seahawks fans were really excited about in the past. I don't think they can come in and push a Derek Hall or Chenna Nwosu or Boye Mafe for starting reps. But, of course, with Draymond Jones, who is also a free agent, Tyler Lockett, of course, is also a free agent, there's some possibilities out there that I think that Seattle is going to be looking to see who is still waiting around. There is still an awful lot of talent available to them. And just unfortunately for a lot of Seahawks fans out there eager to find a blocker, some of the biggest names out there have been snatched up already.
As always, you can follow me on X and Blue Sky at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you listen to your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. When we come back tomorrow, it's the first official day of free agency. We're hoping to have some big news to break down, some signings as the Seahawks start to build their roster for 2025. Make sure that you listen in. Thanks for tuning in and enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. Go Hawks.